All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 12, Section 3, Wealth and Culture in the South. So here we're looking a little bit at the social history of the South, more at class. How did that break down? Now, of course, you had a class of slaves, and then you had free whites. We're going to be looking in this chapter a little bit at this free white population and how that broke down. At the very top of this social pyramid, and that's another good way of, sort of breaking down a specific society. At the very top here, you had the Southern planter. They were the elite class. They were the wealthiest. They held all the political power as well. So these were the individuals who were elected to, governorships. They were senators. They were presidents, in fact. They occupied a very small number, but had an enormous amount of influence in the South. This graph sort of breaks it down. It shows here that majority of whites in the South were not slaveholders. They were not wealthy enough to own slaves. But then you have this constituency here, which is anywhere between 10 and over 100. Here it amounts for about 6 or 7%. We would consider that to be the elite planter class. Everybody else, the rest of this thing, belongs to some of the other classes in society. And so when we look at slave ownership among whites, again, we just did that. We broke that down with the graph there. So the planter elite, what marks them apart besides just their wealth, political power, and slave ownership? That was a real marker as well, how many slaves that you owned. Typically, the number was, 20. That was kind of the cutoff to be in this elite class. This was also a class that was marked by its elegance, by its architecture, by its gardens. A lot of wealth by the Southern plantation owners, or the planter elite class, was held up in land. It's what you purchase. Contrary to the northern counterparts, in the north, it was more a matter of how much money you had, investments, what you have in the bank. Everything by, the Southern elite was mostly material. So you got an image here of, kind of one of these estates that were owned by a planter elite. Like I mentioned before, the planter elite controlled both local and national politics. National influence I have down here, presidency and the Supreme Court. I want to say between presidents 1 through 16, I want to say that, I don't know this exact number, but at least 13 were slave owners, right? Many were slave owners, and also many on the Supreme Court who were appointed were slave owners. And so we're talking about two branches of the government which aren't exactly chosen. I mean, to a certain degree, they're chosen democratically, but not really in a direct way. Another thing that marked off the planter elite class, and this was kind of a social status thing, was that they were marked by no labor, not just the men, but also the women and children. If nobody in the family engaged in any type of physical labor, that was a mark of status. The children, contrary to most in the South, the children of the planter elite were actually well educated. They went to some of the best colleges in the United States at the time, again, not being engaged in any sort of physically demanding type of activity. So that really marks kind of the one class. And even though they're the smallest in number, they have the most power and influence. Below that, you have the yeoman farmers. This is sort of Jefferson's idea of how you build a democratic society. These are land-owning whites. And then below that, you have the landless whites, sometimes called, the poor whites. And economically speaking, right, if we just look at material and economic conditions, they were more similar to what slaves had experienced, eating similar type of food, wearing similar type of clothing, kind of experiencing the same standard of living, but of course they were free, right? They were not enslaved. And what held these classes together was a sense of white supremacy, that despite the fact, again, we're going to look back up at this graph here, despite the fact that most whites don't actually own slaves, they can benefit from the plantation economy. But one thing that all of these people have in common, of course, are their race, right? And that's really how society and culture organized itself in the South. That for even if you're the poorest white, you could say at least you were not a slave. And in fact, that is why some of the poor, so if we write, this, if we say that these are slaves and these are poor whites, because this is really what the law was designed to create. If we think about the poor white or the landless white class and ask, well, why were they such ardent defenders of slaves or slavery, even though they didn't own any slaves? Well, it was because it solidified their social position, that if slavery were to be abolished, the first people to get passed up on the social pyramid are the poorest of whites. And so in some cases, that's why they were so, that's why they defended the institution so, so passionately, even though they actually didn't own any slaves. Whereas in the North, a lot of culture surrounded materialism, what you purchased, material goods. A lot of those material goods were not available in the South, and so different things culturally were more important. Honor was a big one. There was a certain code of honor, respect, we might call this. Family, community, we might say reputation, right? These things were all important. And if somebody challenged that, right? If someone disrespected you or did something to your family member or threatened your community or attacked or tarnished your reputation, you were expected to defend it and defend it using violence. Dueling was a way to maybe defend one's honor with violence. And typically, dueling involved two people getting pistols, taking turns shooting at each other. And, that was a way to ensure that nobody essentially just talked trash, because you get challenged to a duel. In terms of gender, gender refers to the different roles that men and women play, especially in the elite classes. Oops. There was a big distinction, I say big distinction. And this was held in the North as well. The North had this idea of what they call the separate spheres. This was the idea that men and women hold separate kind of responsibilities and roles in society. Typically, men were out in public and women were in the domestic sphere. This was also true for elite Southerners as well. Typically, in the family, there was a male patriarch who held the authority over the household. Women were expected to sort of have these characteristics: piety, grace, modesty. One important thing to make a distinction of is that these gender norms, right? The idea of there being a male patriarch and he has all the authority in the household, and that women should exhibit characteristics of modesty and grace, it did not apply for slaves, at least from the perspective of whites. And what I mean by this did not apply was that men and women who were slaves were forced to do the same work. All right, forced to do the same work. In fact, an interesting thing is that once slavery is abolished after the Civil War in 1865, what you actually see in a lot of the families who had formerly been enslaved was you do begin to see a more sort of gendered breakdown of duties and responsibilities. But in the slave system, those families, those men and women were denied their roles by their slave masters, who forced men and women to do the same tasks, same work out in the cotton fields. And because cotton and slavery had become so important to the Southern economy and to Southern politics, oftentimes you had politicians who defended it. One thing to say about the defense of slavery, because there'll be a lot of arguments made in favor of it, was that slavery was not an institution that was propped up through logical debate or argument. As the saying goes, nobody was ever argued into becoming a slave. You could only be forced to do it. So most of these arguments were empty, but they did kind of reach the mainstream American politics. Probably the most notorious and well-known defender of slavery was John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. So this guy is the most, we'll say the most famous defender of slavery. And he had this idea, concurrent majority, and he wrote this political peace, disquisition on government. And what he argued here was that when and concurrent majority kind of means like a minority majority, right? And this sounds kind of silly, right? How could you be a minority majority? But what he's talking about is that within the whole United States, when there is a specific minority majority group, when there's a minority group, what he means by minority majority is really slave owners. Because what's happening is that the majority, right, the majority is actually Northerners. And so his argument is that when this class specifically, when slave owners are threatened by Northerners, when they threaten specifically the institution of slavery, that as a minority majority class in the South, you do have the political right to, essentially what this leads to is secession. So there's two ideas that are sort of surrounding Calhoun's thought. One is nullify, which we'll talk about at a later time. That means to cancel federal law. And the other one is secession, which means to break away, right? And what Calhoun is arguing is that this group, this slave owners, which again, they're not a majority because Northerners are the majority, right? But they're a majority in the South, they're a majority in a specific part of the country, that if their right to own slaves is threatened, they should be able to band together and mount whatever resistance to that it is. Other arguments, so this would be a political argument in favor of it. Other arguments contrasted it with the North, right? So we might say that one reason or one way that Southerners argued in favor of slavery was to compare it with Northern working conditions, right? You know, working conditions in Northern factories weren't pleasant. Southerners would say, well, at least slaves in the South get to work in the fresh air, in the sunshine. They don't experience from the problems of cities like disease and overcrowding and crime. But the point being is that at least those workers were free. Again, this was an empty argument because when immigrants came to the United States, all of them chose to work in a factory in the North rather than surrendering themselves to slavery. You also had ideas around polygeism. Polygeism, we might just break this down as scientific racism, talking about the inferiority and superiority of certain races. All of these cases were made to defend and argue slavery. However, at the end of the day, like I mentioned before, slavery was not an institution that someone could be argued into. Slavery was only an institution in which someone was forced through violence.